Sorry, is my screen still visible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, it's there.
Yeah, it's still here. Yeah.
Okay. This would be my first shot at the presentation. I didn't have much time to prepare or rehearse.
Oh, that's okay.
Hopefully it'll be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
Hey, David, Justin's testing out that chat for you.
Okay.
So would one of you read out the questions to me, or would I read them in the chat?
I would read the questions to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Onchagwa. I work for building operations and HSSE at Texas A&M, Qatar. We would like to welcome each one of you to our Safety Week. We would like to celebrate this occasion every year, and this year we are having it virtually. So we would like to encourage everyone to participate. We have other things that we do. Students get questions and they have competitions. Even there are other questions for the staff and faculty. Please feel free to participate. And today, our first guest for our lunchtime presentations is our own graduate of 2019. His name is Saad Moazam. He's a mechanical engineer graduate who now is consulting with EY Consulting. Personally, I know him. He has been active, especially in safety, and he was recommended by one of our staff to participate in this. And today, I would like to welcome Saad to talk to us about his experience working in industry. And his title for today is Black Swans, Gray Rhinos, and Dragons, the 21st Century Risk and Complexity. So, Saad, you're welcome. Please go ahead and make your presentation here.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I really appreciate it. And hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank David and the staff member who recommended me for this presentation. And I hope all of your families are safe and well in these unfortunate circumstances. And to all students, to all Texas A&M students, I hope you had a good fall break and you were able to get some rest. It's a pleasure to be back to university, although I wish it wasn't virtually and in such unfortunate circumstances. Some of you may already know me, but for those who do not, my name is Saad, as David mentioned, and I'm a mechanical engineering graduate from TAMUQ. And today I'll be talking about a concept that has been on my mind and I've been researching actively for the last few years since I was a sophomore at university. And luckily, after graduation, I was able to join an industry and a line of service where this is very relevant, and that is risk and complexity and their relationship in the 21st century. So just to summarize the agenda for today, I'll be starting off with a brief background and introduction of what I've been up to for the last few years, including when I was at Texas A&M and what I've been doing since I've graduated. Understanding some honestly unique disaster terminology terms, such as black swans, gray rhinos, and dragon kings, and what they actually mean. Exploring the relationship between risk and complexity. Understanding what I like to call a corporate dilemma, which is the relationship between risk management and safety management in large enterprises and corporations in high-risk industries. And finally, the law of regression to the tail, which is something very recently coined by Dr. Bent Flyvbjerg in Oxford. And this is something that has really, really inspired me. And after reading and researching it, it's really changed my worldview. So it would be good to get everyone's thoughts on this today. So a background and introduction into who I am and what I've been up to for the last few years and what has brought me here today. You might notice these bullet points on the right, and these are just a few of my interests, current interests, which I dabble in and I explore when I'm not busy with work. So you can see things like game theory, economics, finance of the future, and supply chain. They all seem to have one thing in common, and that's looking at the world through as a big picture rather than in a detail-oriented way. So I started off doing mechanical engineering at Texas A&M, and I have very fond memories of my time there and some not so fond memories, which were mostly self-inflicted. By my sophomore year, I had taken the leap of faith to create a health tech startup with a few other people I had met in a conference in Italy. And we ended up starting this company in San Antonio in Texas, registering it there, applying for a patent, which is still pending. But as most digital ventures go, it did not go as planned. And regardless, it was a life-changing experience that completely changed my worldview. Post-graduation, I first started as a product designer for small and medium enterprises in the Middle East, where I was doing consulting and engineering design for small companies who were just getting off the ground and needed support, pro bono support and both paid support in product design. But my startup experience had really, really exposed me to the world of business, and it's just something that I couldn't shake off, and that eventually led me to venturing into a sales position in robotics, where I was trying to sell telepresence robots to corporates and individuals alike. And eventually that has now led to me being a financial consultant with EY Consulting in Doha. And in this role and in this capacity, I find myself working with some of the largest energy companies in the world on things such as finance of the future, technology, and how it has the potential to completely revamp operations, as well as energy transition. And what's next is unknown to me, and I'm sure that I will be staying in the financial consulting realm for a while, because I have found it to be very interesting. And I've also found that I'm able to apply my mechanical engineering degree to this role more so than if I was in a mechanical engineering role. So moving on, in the year 2020 alone we've seen disasters of previously unthinkable magnitude. To quote just a few examples, there have been wide-ranging forest fires in Brazil, ravaging flooding in Sudan, a devastating plane crash in Pakistan, as well as a completely unforeseen and devastating explosion in Beirut, in Lebanon. So you might be wondering why I've left the elephant in the room out of the previous list, and that's because I felt that it deserves an entire page to itself, and that is COVID-19. And to say the least, the last few months have presented enough evidence for the world to take a closer look at how we view large-scale disasters, and more importantly, how we anticipate, mitigate, and respond to them. So all of these events, from COVID-19 to wars, earthquakes, massive explosions, forest fires, and climate change as well, are often categorized into 3 different buckets. And those different buckets are black swans, gray rhinos, and dragon kings. Economists, financial analysts, policymakers, and risk professionals all over the world like to bucket these major events into these categories. So this is a black swan. In the 2nd century, when this term was first coined, a black swan was not known to exist. Hence, this term describes any event that seems to us on the basis of our limited experience to be impossible. So in simple terms, a black swan is an unpredictable event that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. However, there's one serious gap in the concept of black swans, and that's that evolution and education introduce biases into our reasoning, which causes us to expect most phenomena to be normally distributed. We'll come back to the topic of normal distribution near the end of this presentation because I feel it's central to how we currently view major disasters and how maybe we should view them in a different way. So a black swan is obvious in hindsight, which is not good enough in the world in the 21st century because they have often have immense and wide-ranging consequences. So as I mentioned, normal distribution may not be the best way to portray the statistical distribution of black swans, and power laws, as described by Buchanan in 2002, may be a more valid and reasonable way to view black swans. And here are some examples of what we currently, the kinds of events we currently view as black swans. Financial crises, forest fires, movie revenues, wars, and earthquakes are all currently viewed as black swans. Now we come to gray rhinos. And Michelle Wooker coined the term gray rhino to represent a highly probable, high impact event that we often fail to act on. There has been much debate in recent times about whether an event is a gray rhino or a black swan. But in my opinion, the characterization is far less important than how we understand, mitigate, and respond to such events. Here are some examples of events which are currently viewed by economists and financial analysts as black swans. So you see things like cybersecurity, pandemics, the rise of artificial intelligence, and hurricanes, where the key differentiating factor between the black swan and the gray rhino is that the gray rhino is predictable and it's running at you like a gray rhino. A very recent term that has been coined in the world of economics and risk management is the dragon king. And dragon kings are described as exceptionally extreme events that sit outside both normal and power law distributions, which we will come to further on in the presentation, and are usually associated with mechanisms such as earthquake energies rather than being events on their own. So a question that you all might want to keep in mind that we might come back to in the Q&A session is whether an event can simultaneously be a dragon king, a gray rhino, and black swan at the same time, and how individual and societal perspectives can mix the meanings of these terms. Now we look at the normal distribution, which to all engineers, finance people, economists, this is a very, very well-known model where if we were to assume a normal distribution for a large-scale, high-impact disaster, this is where you would find black swans. This is where gray rhinos would live. And beyond the domains of the normal distribution, this is where our dragon kings would reside. However, I don't think it's very important to, I don't believe the characterization of massive unforeseen events is as important as how we respond to them. So leaving behind the strategic perspective, I'd now like to move into the concept of risk management versus safety management in large corporations and enterprises. What you see here, and many of you may be familiar with this unfortunate image, is the demise of the Deepwater Horizon incident that BP was involved in the Gulf of Mexico. So I use this as a background image since it makes for a good, it really sets the context for an interesting phenomenon that I've observed in my experience in industry, both on an operational level and on a strategic level. And I've also researched over the last few years. And that is the relationship between risk and safety teams in large corporations. Risk and safety are two corporate functions that have very similar objectives, but often have very different and often conflicting approaches to achieve those objectives. You would think that risk and safety go hand in hand at large enterprises in high-risk industries, but I have often observed their relationship to look more like this. Again, on both an operational and strategic level. And what this does and has done in the past is create a real corporate dilemma for executive management. And that's why I would like to shed some light on it today and also get your thoughts and input in the end. So the objective for exploring this topic is to try to understand why this kind of tug of war between two fundamental core functions exists and what we can do to get rid of it. So as we said previously, safety management and risk management are generally not working together. However, they seek the same goals and outcomes. This results in significant operational issues for businesses in all industries. And these common goals and outcomes that we talk about are reduced losses and more efficient financing of these losses. This often leads to duplicated and overlapping efforts, which are inefficient and expensive. And that's counterintuitive to the existence of both of these departments, which have goals to increase efficiency and reach more efficient financing of losses. So I've said the word financing a few times, and it's leading to the fact that I believe there is one key difference between the two corporate functions, which is finance. And in the next slide, I'll elaborate what I mean by this. So the biggest difference, in my opinion, between the two disciplines is finance. While risk management always considers the cost of financing losses, including the cost to mitigate the loss, safety departments often do not. Safety departments may calculate the cost of the loss, including direct and indirect costs, but they rarely, if ever, get involved with where the money will come from to pay for the loss within the organization. And this is most definitely and generally not the fault of the safety department or the safety manager in a corporation, but instead it is indicative of the relationship between safety and executive management. And that's the fact that executive managers often fail to recognize safety's ability to contribute in this area and instead relegate all financing decisions to the accounting and finance division of the organization, which is better known as risk management. So we will look at financing decisions and how they can be heavily involved in insurance contracts, funded reserves, the reserves, and many other types of financial instruments to pay for losses, and how risk management may not be best placed to make these financing decisions in isolation from the technical expertise that our safety professionals of today have. So when I first started exploring this phenomenon through both experience and reading and research, I was very confused because safety departments exist for the purpose of loss mitigation, whereas risk departments exist for the purpose of loss financing, both of which can save any organization significant amounts of money and reputation, as well as human lives. So to say that one discipline is better than the other is not a valid point, and it's not something that's worth pursuing. Neither of these two departments, risk and safety, can exist in isolation. However, they currently do exist together, but do not work effectively. And that's what presents the problem statement for this topic and concept that I'm speaking about today. So what's the solution? In my opinion, integration of the two functions may be a viable solution so that risk can be evaluated on a more enterprise-wide level by risk management and through a more in-depth analysis by safety management. And contracts is an area which presents perhaps the greatest improvement for this, solution or conceptual solution. Contractual transfer for risk is a technique not only for transferring the cost of risk, but it can also be used to transfer the risk itself. However, many safety professionals do not get involved in negotiating stage of contracts, despite the fact that this is where their expertise is best utilized. By understanding what the contract requires, they can assist the organization in transferring all or part of the risk under the contract, thus eliminating or reducing the overall risk to the organization. And this, through my personal observations in industry, is something that is not happening or not happening enough. Safety professionals are not involved in contracts and contractual decisions as much as risk management professionals are. And this is something that can give rise to risks in the future and what we might call black swans, gray rhinos, or dragon kings, even though they may not be as unlikely as we expect them to be, should safety professionals be involved in this area. So to summarize, safety professionals are best placed to drive this integration and should actively play a larger role. And safety professionals of today and my colleagues, which are chemical engineers and mechanical engineers involved in the domain of safety, should, I believe, become more accustomed to the world of finance and start to speak the same language that executive management and risk management speaks, because their technical experience is something that can really bring value to an organization from a strategic risk perspective. So I'd like to leave behind the world of corporations and enterprises and look at the entire globe from an eagle-eye view. And as we all know, our world is changing more positively and rapidly than ever before in human history. But with positive change come significant risks and ramifications, which, if not properly understood, can become what people like to call black swans, gray rhinos, and dragon kings. And the concept that I think lies at the heart of risk and the heart of global risk and the global risk profile is complexity. And which is why I believe that it's important for all of us to understand the concept of complexity to properly understand what risks the future holds. So here are some mega trends that the economists and financial analysts and researchers have identified between the year 2020 and the year 2030. So within now and the next decade, the impact of technology will be unprecedented. As you can see, 90% of the world's data was created only in the last 2 years. 1 trillion objects will be connected by 2022, which is the IoT revolution. And surprisingly enough to me, as a financial consultant, this came as a surprise that 90% of all stock trades are now created by algorithms. Evolving communities, you see that global life expectancies are rising. We are increasingly connected, and Africa and Asia are driving global growth. Rapid urbanization, 1.5 million people are joining cities per week. And by the year 2030, 66% of the world's population will be living in cities. Individuals are much more empowered than they were just 18 years ago. 66% of people are connected online. There's an unprecedented growth in consumption and economic output and ability for our populations to consume both products and services. There's an economic power shift, as I mentioned before. You have the E7 economies becoming double the size of the G7 by 2040. And last but not least, and this is something connected very closely to climate change, we have resource scarcity. So by 2050, the seafood industry will collapse. Phosphorus, which is a very important chemical for clean energy solutions, will be at critical levels by 2050. And we require a 59% increase in global food production by the year 2050. Not to mention the risk that has been identified as the #1 global risk, which is the water crisis. So having researched these trends, I can't help but ask myself whether we can extrapolate from these statistics and from these trends and extrapolate our understanding to envision what the global risk profile might look like 10 years from now. So I'd like to pause here and ask a question which you can respond to in the Q&A session. And that's what do you think? Do these global trends hide any black swans, gray rhinos, or dragon kings as we described them earlier within them? And is there any merit for young people such as engineers in technical institutions to start to imagine what will happen in the future? So I'll use a bit of an analogy here. This is a decision maker in the year 1980. So we're going back to the concept of complexity. And this decision maker has the task of straightening out a very badly intertwined wire in the year 1980. He believes it to be a significant and difficult task, but he feels that it is simple enough to be able to do so. Fast forward to 2020, and the decision makers of today have a much more complex and bigger task at hand when making a similar decision. And I'll use this image to transition into something called the law of regression to the tail, inspired by Dr. Bent Flyvbjerg in the University of Oxford. So there is nothing as practical as a theory that is correct, and regression to the mean is a mathematically well-proven theory for many, many types of statistics, and is extremely useful in applications such as health, insurance, gambling, and also in risk management, for example, in flight safety. However, we often overlook a very, very important aspect of regression to the mean, which is that it presupposes that a population mean actually exists. And this is something that I have in my conversations and dealings with clients and individuals in the industry, especially in the energy industry. I've observed this firsthand. And that's the fact that for some random events of great social consequence, such as a massive oil spill, we attempt to characterize examples such as black swans, gray rhinos, or dragon kings, but it is even more important to understand regression to the tail and how it is different from regression to the mean. And that is due to the fact that we often overlook the fact that there is a population mean. So even though we can say that black swans live here, gray rhinos live here, and dragon kings live outside the domains of what we currently know, there may be no population mean because of infinite variance in these unforeseen and huge events. So A mathematical model that better or probability distribution that better describes this and that better describes these kind of events is regression to the tail. And probability distributions of pandemics, wars, floods, earthquakes, etc. either distribute no population mean, or the mean is so badly defined due to infinite variance because they are so rare. So assuming that these events follow a normal distribution can give rise to a false sense of security, which eventually leads to a reactive rather than proactive mitigation. Dr. Flyvbjerg suggests that we name this phenomenon the law of regression to the tail. In summary, this depicts a situation with many extreme events, and no matter how extreme the most extreme event is, there will always be an event that is more extreme than this. And we can take COVID-19 as an example, and I'll come to this later. So it's the summary of regression to the tail is that it is only a matter of time until a worse and more extreme event appears. And the frequency of new extremes and to what extent they exceed historical events is key in determining how fat-tailed a distribution will be. So I'll move on to the next slide to basically explain what I mean by regression to the tail and what a fat-tailed risk looks like. So here you can see the fat tails that I mentioned. And it's these fat tails where in a normal distribution setting, we assume risk to be very, very close to zero, but the law of regression to the tail explains that risk is in fact not as close to zero as we believe it to be and can be much higher. And this is what we call the heavy tail, where you see the blue exponential chart portraying a normal distribution and the heavy tail regression to the tail, which shows that there is an infinite regression to infinity when it comes to unforeseen risks. So how can we view COVID-19 as this kind of regression to the tail? So the distribution of sample means, so two ways that we cannot look at COVID-19 and pandemics is through the concept of normal distribution and closing our eyes and hoping for the best. Both of these are not valid ways for strategists and operational experts to view COVID-19 going forward. To avoid similar failure in the future, leaders and citizens both must understand and act in accordance with the law of regression to the tail. And in the case of pandemics, we've seen that there are two main lessons to be learned. First of all, everyone needs to be honest about and keep in mind that there will be more pandemics in the future, and that one of these will be worse than COVID-19. This might make you feel uncomfortable, but it's an uncomfortable fact that follows directly from the power law distribution that pandemics follow, as you can see on the screen. Secondly, once leaders and citizens have come to terms with the first lesson, we must understand that pandemics involve regression to the tail, and that is how we will understand how to handle the next pandemic. And we'll come to what the mitigation strategies and the 4 key principles are when it comes to dealing with events such as pandemics, earthquakes, hurricanes, wars, and financial crises. To summarize, this is not the last or the worst pandemic, and we may see one even within our lifetimes. Pandemics exhibit regression to the tail, and this is something that we need to understand to be able to better handle the next one. It's needless to say that the world hasn't handled this pandemic the way it ideally should have. And that these lessons are general and applicable to all phenomena that exhibit regression to the tail. Next, rebuilding the world economy is also something that will be subject to regression to the tail. When we look at the energy industry, projects such as nuclear and power plants and dams are fat-tailed for financial risk, as opposed to wind farms and energy storage, which are rapid, modular, and thin-tailed. And this really presents a real paradigm shift in the world of financial and investment analysis. And this is something that I believe can help us reach climate goals faster. Moving on, since I know we only have a minute or so left, here are basic mitigation principles following on from the regression to the tail theory that we've discussed, and basically giving us 4 pointers on how we should view large-scale risks and disasters going forward. Number 1, we need to cut the tail. And how we can cut the tail is using a precautionary principle, making sure that necessary contingencies are in place for future risks that may happen and are likely to happen. And last but certainly not least, taking action immediately, at speed, and at scale. If we follow these 4 principles proactively, regression to the tail will mostly be manageable. However, if we don't, and we haven't as a global society in the past, tail events will come back to haunt us over and over again, causing unnecessary carnage while we scramble reactively rather than proactively to put in place measures that, to anyone who understands the concept of regression to the tail, should have been in place much longer ago, as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to round out this presentation and open the floor for questions with this image. The biggest and most urgent tail risk we face today is climate change, and there is no plausible reason to dispute climate science. And so the phenomenon of regression to the tail is especially applicable here. The concept of fat-tailed risk tells us what the focus for climate change and climate mitigation must be. Number 1, we need to identify which mitigation measures are particularly scalable at blitz-like speeds and which are not, and place emphasis on those that are. And number 2, we need to accelerate and ramp up measures for those mitigation measures that are scalable and rapid, while ruthlessly scrapping those which are not, such as nuclear power plants and hydroelectric dams, because of the simple point that we do not have time to waste. If we do this and we truly understand the urgency of the law of regression to the tail for climate change, we have a chance to survive this particular tail risk. However, if we do not, it will likely mean farewell to the world as we know it today. So rather than closing our eyes and hoping for the best as a global society, we need to understand regression to the tail and how it applies to climate change. And what climate change may present the world with may make COVID-19 and what we've just been through seem like a picnic in comparison. Thank you for your time and listening to me. And now I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Saad, for that presentation. I don't see any questions shared here, but I have a question for you.
Sure.
What could be your advice for students who are looking forward to go to industry from your experience?
So the number 1 advice I would have for students is to understand that industry, regardless of which industry it is changing. And the industry very rarely looks like what we read in our textbooks. Our textbooks are a very valid and a very important basis of understanding. But the industry looks very different when you leave academia and you join the industry. And I've faced this firsthand, and oftentimes I've found 2 things to be my best friends: YouTube and Google. The number of times I've used YouTube and Google to understand new concepts, understand where the industry is heading, and by that I'm speaking about the oil and gas industry. There are numerous times where these things come in handy. So I would advise students and many of my colleagues who are still studying at university to start to explore beyond your major, explore beyond the subject that you are studying. You may be studying mechanical engineering, you may be studying chemical engineering or business or finance, but once you join industry, you very, very rarely work in isolation. And oftentimes you may have to be an engineer, a financial analyst, and a risk expert all at the same time. So there is merit to exploring different things, going online and reaching out to people, reaching out to alumni, reaching out to your professors who have more experience, and understanding how you can model yourself as a multi-dimensional professional rather than just as a specialist, because that's something that has come in handy for me, and it's something that interests me much more in the industry.
Thank you so much, Saad. I have two questions for you
Yes.
here. So I have one question from Kent. He's asking, while safer on a singular level, doesn't application of precautionary principle intentionally cut of events that could happen when they could instead be mitigated or accepted? For example, the COVID vaccines that are all in development, not to be accepted because of the risks they impose?
Yes, so that's a very good question. If I do pick up on the specific example, which is the COVID-19 vaccines, if I understand correctly, the question is whether it is worth taking a risk to solve or to mitigate another risk. Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So obviously, I am no quantitative risk professional, nor am I a safety professional, but what makes sense to me is basically how big one risk is versus another. The problem is that COVID-19 vaccines are what we might call dragon kings. We do not know what their ramifications may be. However, their need is urgent and unquestionable in the world of today, because and whether we should pursue vaccines as a mitigation strategy for COVID-19 or not is something that many countries are divided upon. You see Scandinavian countries taking a much more different approach as opposed to Middle Eastern countries, which may be first in line to use these vaccines. So it is a strategic question, and it is something that requires more than quantitative analysis. It requires good decision making on the part of our leaders and policymakers and health professionals.
Oh, thank you so much. I have another question from Ramdas. The question is, what and how would you make the change to current safety professionals to be good at risk management as you see them? They are currently not. How would you measure that change?
Okay, that's a very good question, and it's something that it's a discussion I've had with colleagues in the who are in safety roles in the industry, and that's exposure to the world of finance. So I believe that safety professionals have a much more extensive technical base of knowledge, which is very important in risk management, but they may not have the knowledge and understanding of finance. So there are numerous certifications online, one of which I'm pursuing myself right now, which is the Financial Modeling and Valuation Analyst by the Corporate Finance Institute, that you can do in 4 to 6 months of time. And in those 4 to 6 months, it can add a new dimension to a safety professional, which means that safety professionals can begin to start speaking the language of risk management professionals and executive management, more importantly, so that safety professionals can stop being viewed as quantitative analysts or basically people who do calculations, rather be viewed as strategic partners when it comes to risk management. So the advice is to increase your exposure to the world of finance and strategy, and easy ways to do that are through short, well-reputed certifications like FMVA.
Yes, Saad, I don't see any other question again. So I would like to thank you once again for taking time to make this presentation. We are grateful and thankful. Also, we would like you to come next time and maybe make another presentation.
Of course, hopefully
Yes,
in person.
Yes. So for our audience, we have another presentation tomorrow. And tomorrow, our presentation is going to be from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock because our speaker will be from the US. So please register for that presentation. And I'm sure you'll enjoy because we are seeing a lot of good things we are learning from this safety week. Thank you, everybody.
Definitely.
And I wish you well. This looks like this. Okay. I thought it was a question, but it's not a question. Okay. Thank you,
No worries.
everyone, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.